In 1932, a man named Earl Simmons walked into a Chicago pawnshop with a paper bag tucked under his arm. Inside were 47 rubber bands, a tin of axle grease, 3 used light bulbs, and a small glass jar filled with bacon drippings. The pawnbroker stared at him for a long moment. Earl stared back. Then the pawnbroker nodded, opened his cash drawer, and gave Earl 62 cents. Earl walked out, bought bread, and fed his family for 2 more days. That story might sound bizarre to anyone alive today, but in the depths of the Great Depression, it was completely ordinary. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, it didn't just wipe out fortunes on Wall Street. It unraveled the entire fabric of daily American life. By 1933, 1 in 4 workers had no job. Families lost farms. Banks closed overnight. Millions ate from soup kitchens or didn't eat at all. And in that brutal new reality, Americans began to see the world around them completely differently. Things that had been garbage became treasure. Objects that had no monetary value became lifelines. People developed collections that would seem incomprehensible today, but made absolute sense in a world where nothing could be wasted and everything might someday save your life. We found 25 of the strangest things Americans collected during the Great Depression, and some of them will genuinely shock you. Number 14 was actually banned in several counties. Number 8 led to fistfights at the town dump. And number 1, the most collected item of the entire era, is something sitting in almost every American home right now. If you've ever wondered how your grandparents survived the hardest decade in American history, make sure you subscribe and watch until the end, because this story is going to change how you see everything in your home. Number 25 is where we start, and it's probably in your kitchen right now. Number 25 was used cooking grease, and the fact that families collected it in dedicated jars tells you everything you need to know about how differently Americans thought about waste during the Depression. Today, most people pour bacon grease down the drain or throw it in the trash without a second thought. But in Depression-era households, the grease that dripped from cooking meat was carefully poured into ceramic crocks or old coffee cans and stored near the stove, sometimes for months. It served multiple purposes that a modern kitchen simply doesn't need to worry about. It was used as a cooking fat when there was no butter or lard. It was rubbed onto squeaky door hinges and stiff leather boots. It was applied to cast iron pans to prevent rust. Some families used it as a base ingredient in homemade soap. And in the hardest of times, it was even spread thin on bread as a substitute for butter. Families developed their own systems for managing grease jars, straining it through cheesecloth to remove food particles, labeling jars by what meat had produced the grease, and trading excess drippings with neighbors the way people today might trade garden vegetables. The collection of cooking grease wasn't hoarding, it was intelligent resource management practiced by people who could not afford the luxury of waste. Number 24 was aluminum foil, which was actually called tin foil during most of the Depression years, because true aluminum foil wasn't widely available until the late 1930s. Even then, it was expensive enough that no household threw it away after a single use. Families smoothed it flat after each use, folded it carefully, and stored it in kitchen drawers, sometimes accumulating balls of reused foil that could weigh several pounds after years of careful collecting. The foil was reused dozens of times on the same piece. Children were taught from early ages to unwrap anything foil-covered carefully rather than tearing it. Some families accumulated so much reused foil that they could sell small amounts to scrap dealers for a few pennies per pound, and those few pennies bought real things in Depression-era markets. Number 23 was rubber bands, and Depression-era Americans collected them with the same dedication a modern child might collect baseball cards. Rubber was expensive, and the bands that arrived on newspapers, around bundles of produce, or packaging from stores were stripped off carefully, stretched over doorknobs or cabinet handles, and stored in dedicated drawers. Larger rubber bands from commercial packaging were particularly prized. The bands had dozens of uses around Depression-era homes, from bundling papers and garden tools to making slingshots and repairing broken straps on overalls. Children made rubber band balls that could grow over years to the size of a grapefruit. Number 22 was string and twine, collected in balls that some families grew over decades. Every piece of string that arrived with a package, every bit of twine used to wrap a bundle from the butcher, Every piece of cord pulled from feed sacks was wound carefully onto a central ball and stored. These string balls weren't just practical storage. They became family objects, passed from parent to child, growing larger with each generation. A well-maintained string ball was a source of genuine pride. The string had uses ranging from tying up garden plants to mending, from hanging laundry to bundling kindling. In rural areas, heavy twine from burlap feed sacks was particularly valuable, and families who lived near farms sometimes traded food for lengths of quality twine. Number 21 was buttons, cut from worn-out clothing before the garments were retired to rags. Depression-era Americans kept button tins, often old cookie tins or tobacco cans, filled with hundreds of buttons sorted loosely by size and color. When a shirt collar wore through, the shirt became a rag, but the buttons were clipped off and added to the tin. When a coat became too threadbare to wear, the buttons were removed first. These button collections were genuinely useful because buttons broke, were lost, and needed replacing constantly on clothing that was worn every day and repaired rather than replaced. Children sorted button tins as a pastime. Grandmothers used them as teaching tools for counting. And when a particular coat or dress needed a new button, the family tin was the first place anyone looked. Number 20 was paper bags, which were reused until they literally fell apart. Paper bags from grocery stores, bakeries, and butcher shops were smoothed flat when emptied, stacked neatly, and stored in kitchen drawers. They were used as lunch bags, wrapping paper, notebook paper for children's homework when real paper wasn't available, fire starters, and material for covering school books. In some households, paper bags were cut open along the seams, flattened completely, and used as a kind of rough wallpaper to cover drafty gaps in walls. The practice of saving paper bags was so ingrained in Depression-era culture that the habit persisted in many families well into the post-war era, carried forward by people who simply could not bring themselves to discard something that still had use in it. Number 19 was coffee grounds, which Depression-era families used 2 and sometimes 3 times before discarding them. The practice of reusing coffee grounds was so common that it had its own name in some households, stretching the coffee. The first brew from fresh grounds produced a normal cup of coffee. The second brew from the same grounds produced something weaker, but still drinkable. And the third brew, in truly desperate times, produced something that was more coffee-flavored hot water than actual coffee. But it was warm, and it had some taste, and it cost nothing additional. Used grounds that were finally too depleted to brew were then repurposed as fertilizer in kitchen gardens, as a mild abrasive for cleaning, or as an odor absorber in icebox interiors. Nothing was discarded while it still had a function. If you're amazed by what people figured out how to reuse during the Depression, you'll want to stick around because the next few items get even more creative. Leave a comment below telling me which item you've seen your own grandparents use, and let's see how many of these traditions survived into the modern era. Number 18 might genuinely surprise you. Number 18 was newspapers, which served so many functions beyond reading that entire Depression-era households were built around the assumption of a steady newspaper supply. Newspapers were used as insulation, stuffed inside walls and underneath floors. They were wrapped around feet inside shoes when the soles wore through. They were layered under rugs and carpets to add warmth. Sheets of newspaper folded into clever patterns became bowls, hats, fans, and fire starters. They were used as tablecloths when actual cloth tablecloths wore out. The news was almost secondary to the material itself. Families who couldn't afford a newspaper subscription traded with neighbors, passing copies around the block until the pages were gray with handling. Number 17 was glass jars, specifically canning jars and any other glass container sturdy enough to hold a seal. The canning jar was the Depression-era household's most important container, used to preserve every vegetable, fruit, meat, and condiment that could be processed and stored. But families also collected all manner of glass containers from commercial products, cleaning them thoroughly and putting them to use as drinking glasses, food storage containers, water glasses, drinking glasses for children. Glass mayonnaise jars became drinking glasses. Pickle jars became flour containers. Peanut butter jars, which had wide mouths and sturdy walls, were among the most prized of all commercial glass containers. A family with 50 good glass jars of various sizes was genuinely better equipped for survival than one without them. Number 16 was seed packets and loose seeds, collected from every edible plant the family grew or obtained. Depression-era gardeners understood at a deep level that the seed was the fundamental unit of food security. At the end of every growing season, the best specimens from every plant, the largest tomato, the fullest ear of corn, the fattest bean, were selected not for eating, but for seeding. They were dried carefully, labeled with handwritten paper slips, and stored in envelopes or small cloth bags. These seed collections represented accumulated knowledge about which varieties grew best in local soil and climate. Knowledge that had sometimes been assembled over multiple generations. Families traded seeds with neighbors the way collectors trade cards, swapping varieties and sharing cultivation tips. Number 15 was coal and wood ash, collected from fireplaces and stoves in containers kept specifically for that purpose. Ash had numerous practical applications that Depression-era families exploited fully. Mixed with water and fat, it produced lye soap. Scattered on icy walkways, it provided traction. Spread on garden soil, it adjusted pH and added potassium. Applied to young plants, it repelled certain garden pests. Used in small quantities in the chicken coop, it helped control parasites and odor. The ash from hardwoods was considered more valuable than the ash from softwoods because it had a higher mineral content, and families who heated with different fuels sometimes kept separate containers for different ash types. Number 14 was rat and mouse traps, which brings us to one of the darker and more practical realities of Depression-era survival. In rural areas and small towns, successful trapping of wild game, including animals that modern Americans would consider vermin, was a genuine food source. Rabbit was the most common and socially acceptable wild meat, but squirrel, possum, and in truly desperate times, rats themselves, were consumed by families with no other options. The collection of traps was therefore a serious matter. Families accumulated spring traps, box traps, and cage traps of various sizes, often buying them secondhand, trading for them, or building their own from scavenged wire and wood. In several counties in Appalachia and the rural South, the resale of traps was actually regulated because the pressure on wild animal populations had become so intense that authorities feared total local extinction of small game species. Number 13 was tin cans, every size from sardine tins to large coffee cans, collected and stored in sheds and garages for their almost unlimited utility as containers. Tin cans were cleaned, had their sharp edges flattened, and were repurposed as drinking cups, planting pots for seedlings, paint containers, nail and screw organizers, candle holders, and cooking vessels. Large coffee cans were among the most valued because their size made them useful for everything from storing dried beans to mixing plaster to carrying water. Children used tin cans to make toys, tin can telephones, rolling toys, and simple percussion instruments. Metal scrap dealers paid small amounts for large accumulations of clean tin cans, giving families another incremental revenue stream from objects most people would throw away. If you're still watching, make sure you're subscribed, because the items from 12 down to 1 are where things get genuinely strange. Number 12 was chicken feathers, specifically the down feathers plucked from any chicken the family slaughtered, collected in cloth bags and used to stuff pillows, quilts, and mattress pads. A single chicken yielded a small handful of down, so accumulating enough for a full pillow required the feathers from dozens of birds saved over months or even years. Families who kept laying hens would also collect the molted feathers their birds shed naturally, adding those to the bags without needing to slaughter anything. The resulting pillows and quilts were not uniform or beautiful, but they were warm, and warmth in a house heated only by a fireplace or wood stove was not optional. Number 11 was flour sacks, which by the mid-1930s had become so important as fabric that flour manufacturers began printing their sacks in bright floral and gingham patterns, specifically to appeal to Depression-era families who would use the fabric for clothing. A flour sack from a 50-pound bag of flour, washed and opened along its seams, yielded a substantial piece of sturdy cotton fabric. Children's dresses, shirts, underwear, aprons, dish towels, curtains, and quilt squares were all made from flour sack fabric. Families who baked in large quantities accumulated sacks quickly, and those who didn't bake as much traded, purchased, or were given sacks by neighbors. The brand printed on the sack was secondary to the quality and color of the fabric, and some women became highly particular about which flour brands produced the most attractive or durable sack material. Number 10 was copper wire and copper pipe scrap, collected for its resale value at scrap dealers. Copper was among the most consistently valuable scrap metals, and Depression-era Americans stripped copper wire from old appliances, plumbing fixtures, and electrical systems that were being demolished or replaced. The wire was bundled, the pipe was cut into manageable lengths, and the accumulation was sold to scrap dealers who paid by the pound. Families who lived near industrial areas, railroad yards, or construction zones had better access to copper scrap than those in purely agricultural areas, and the practice of collecting it was widespread enough that copper theft from standing structures became a genuine problem that communities had to police. Number 9 was animal bones, specifically large bones from any meat the family cooked, collected and boiled repeatedly to make stock before finally being used in other ways. Once a bone had given everything it had to multiple batches of soup stock, it could be dried and cracked to extract the marrow fat, which was then used in cooking. The dried bones themselves could be sold to specialty dealers who processed them into bone meal fertilizer or bone char for water filtration. Some families made crude bone tools or children's toys from large bones. In agricultural communities, large accumulations of dried bones were sometimes traded directly to farmers who used them as fertilizer, creating another small economic loop within the local survival economy. Number 8 was items from the town dump, which during the Depression became a shopping destination rather than a disposal site. The practice of picking through the town dump for usable goods was widespread enough to cause genuine conflict, because what one family discarded in a moment of relative prosperity might be desperately needed by another family a month later. Arguments and fistfights over dump finds were recorded in local newspapers across the country. Families sent their most agile members, usually older children and teenagers, to scout the dump after each collection day, looking for furniture that needed only minor repair, tools with broken handles that could be replaced, clothing that was merely unfashionable rather than truly worn out, and glass containers of every description. Some families furnished entire rooms with dump finds. Others built working gardens using salvaged tools. The Depression-era dump was a second-hand store without a price tag. Number 7 was pine tar and linseed oil, collected and stored by rural families who used these substances to treat wood, leather, and skin. Pine tar was gathered directly from pine trees using a process of slow heating that was labor-intensive but cost nothing for families with access to pine forests. It was used to waterproof fence posts and wood-shingled roofs, treat cracked and dry leather boots, and as a skin treatment for livestock and sometimes for humans dealing with rashes and fungal infections. Linseed oil, pressed from flaxseed, was similarly prized for wood preservation and was sometimes traded or sold. Families who lived near flax-growing regions or could grow their own small plots had a genuine advantage. Leave a comment right now telling me if your grandparents ever used pine tar, because I want to know how far this practice actually spread. Number 6 was newspapers clippings and recipe cards from any source available, carefully cut and organized in boxes or folders. Depression-era women, who were primarily responsible for stretching food budgets to impossible extremes, collected recipes with a ferocity that a modern person might reserve for financial documents, because that's exactly what they were. A recipe for making 1 pound of ground meat feed 8 people was worth real money in the Depression household economy. Recipes for stretchable soups, breadless sandwiches, meatless stews, and sugarless desserts were traded, copied by hand, and passed around communities. The USDA and various relief organizations published recipe booklets specifically aimed at Depression households, and these were collected and preserved as seriously as legal documents. Some of these recipe collections, passed down through families, still survive today and represent a remarkable archive of American domestic ingenuity. Number 5 was candle stubs, collected from any source because artificial light after dark was not optional, but candles were expensive. When a candle burned down to within an inch of its holder, the stub was removed and stored. When enough stubs had been accumulated, they were melted together in a tin can set in a pot of hot water, and a new candle was formed by dipping a string wick through the melted wax repeatedly or pouring the wax into a mold made from a rolled paper tube. Families also added any other available wax to their collections, including the wax from old phonograph records that had been damaged beyond playability, the paraffin used for canning jar seals, and the wax from old shoe polish tins. The resulting homemade candles were irregular, lumpy, and sometimes smelled unusual. But they produced light, which was the only specification that mattered. Number 4 was old tires and inner tubes, collected by rural families for the almost unlimited utility of the rubber. When a tire was too worn to provide traction on a vehicle, it could be cut into strips and used as an extremely durable repair material for almost anything. Strips of tire rubber were used to patch holes in buckets and roofs, reinforce the soles of worn shoes, create gaskets for mechanical equipment, make slings for children's swings, and hundreds of other applications where a tough, weatherproof material was needed. Inner tubes were even more versatile because the thinner rubber could be cut into bands for slingshots, stretched over containers as waterproof seals, and used as repair patches for other rubber items. In farming communities, where large tractor tires occasionally wore out, a single worn tractor tire yielded enough usable rubber to supply a family for months. Number 3 was coat hangers, which were returned to dry cleaners before coat hanger recycling became standard practice, and were also collected from any other source available. The wire in a coat hanger could be bent and shaped into dozens of useful objects, from hooks and hangers to makeshift tools and structural elements in small repairs. Children made toys from coat hanger wire. Adults straightened the wire to use as a probe for unclogging drains or as a crude drill bit for making holes in thin wood. Multiple hangers bound together could form rigid structural frames for small storage solutions. The wire in a coat hanger, in capable Depression-era hands, was not a clothes storage device but a raw material with dozens of potential lives. Number 2 was cardboard, specifically the stiffened cardboard from boxes, cereal containers, and commercial packaging. Cardboard had so many uses in a Depression-era household that families who lived near stores or commercial establishments sometimes developed arrangements to take cardboard regularly in exchange for small services or food. Cardboard was used to insulate floors and walls, to create templates for making and repairing clothing, to reinforce broken furniture, to create dividers in drawers and shelves, to waterproof leaky spots under roofing material temporarily, and to create signs and writing surfaces for children. Corrugated cardboard from larger boxes was particularly prized because the air pockets in the corrugation provided genuine insulation value. A sheet of corrugated cardboard laid on a cold floor under a sleeping area could make a real difference in winter warmth. And now, we arrive at number 1, the single most collected, most hoarded, most carefully accumulated item across all of Depression-era America. It was something so ordinary, so universally available, and so completely overlooked today that most people reading this will find it hard to believe it was ever treated as precious. Number 1 was used tinfoil balls, which were actually called tinfoil balls, even after aluminum replaced actual tin in the foil's construction. These balls started with a single piece of foil saved from a chewing gum wrapper, a candy bar, or a cigarette package. The foil was smoothed carefully and rolled into a small ball. Each additional piece of foil was smoothed and added to the ball, which grew over weeks and months until it might reach the size of a baseball. The appeal of the tinfoil ball was threefold. First, it was tangible evidence of accumulation, of saving rather than wasting. In a culture under constant economic pressure, the visible growth of something you'd otherwise discard was psychologically meaningful. Second, it had genuine utility as a block of metal that could be sold to scrap dealers, melted down, and recycled. A baseball-sized tin-foil ball might bring a few cents, and a few cents was meaningful in 1933. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it was something children could contribute to. Parents taught children to collect foil from every wrapper they found, adding it to the family ball. The practice gave children agency in the household survival strategy, made them feel useful, and kept them engaged in the larger project of getting through hard times together. The tinfoil ball was not just a ball of metal. It was the Depression-era family's philosophy made physical. Nothing is wasted. Everything contributes, and small things accumulated over time become something real and valuable. There's a reason these 25 items were collected by people who had lived through prosperity and were now navigating poverty. It wasn't desperation alone that drove them. It was intelligence, creativity, and a refusal to accept that hard times meant passive surrender. The people who saved their grease jars and their coat hangers, who picked through the dump and grew their own seed collections, who made new candles from old stubs and kept their string balls growing for decades. These people didn't just survive the Great Depression. They built the habits and knowledge and community relationships that carried them through it. They fed their families. They kept their homes. They raised children who carried those lessons forward into a post-war prosperity that the parents had often doubted they would ever see. Every item on this list is a lesson, and the lesson is the same for all 25 of them. In hard times, nothing is worthless unless you decide it is. Now here's your challenge. Go through your home this week and count how many of these 25 things you still have some version of. Do you save cooking grease? Do you keep a button collection? Do you reuse glass jars? Tell me in the comments how many of these habits you or your family still practice, because I genuinely believe that the wisdom of the Depression generation is still alive in American households everywhere, waiting to be remembered. If this story connected with you, share it with someone who loves American history, and we'll see you in the next one.